Okay, so this has been making the rounds, and for good reason. It is crazy. Microsoft is planning major job cuts, not just within their Xbox gaming division, but company-wide. They're looking to do major cuts across the organization, across the board, okay? This is by Jason Schreier. He says, Microsoft Corp will conduct another round of major layoffs in its Xbox division next week as part of a company-wide reorganization. So to be clear, it's not just Xbox. It's just that Jason reports primarily on gaming. So he's specifically calling out Xbox division, but it's also hitting everything else in Xbox, or within Microsoft rather. Managers within Xbox are expecting substantial cuts across the entire group, according to people familiar with the plans who asked not to be identified, discussing non-public information. The company declined to comment, which is basically an admittance. This will be the fourth big layoff at Xbox in the past 18 months, following three major cuts last year and the closure of several subsidiaries. Xbox, which produces video game hardware and software, has been under pressure from Microsoft executives to boost profit margins since purchasing Activision Blizzard Incorporated for $69 billion in a deal that closed in 2023. Bloomberg News earlier reported that Microsoft plans to cut thousands of jobs next week, largely in sales. And the tech giant often makes major organizational changes close to the end of its fiscal year, which concludes on June 30th. And these are important things to note. So first of all, blah, 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 insert meme about Luke mentioning he has a degree in corporate finance again. It's true. I have a degree in corporate finance, so this is literally my bread and butter, okay? That being said, I think it's important just to stress that organizational changes at Microsoft and other gigantic giga corporations, very, very normal. Very, very normal. People say Microsoft is a $3 trillion company, right? They're like, it's a $3 trillion company. Why are they having to restructure and lay people off? Why are they doing this? Well, they're a $3 trillion company because they do things like this, because they will fire 60 people in a group of 100 devs, and then they'll rehire 50 of those people as contractors, so they don't need to pay them benefits. They cut costs, but they retain the same development talent to work on Windows or to work on Microsoft Office products or whatever else it is. And this is just a regular cyclical thing that they do. It's well known. My dad has worked for Microsoft, and this is something that happened to him where he got laid off and they restructured and he moved to a different company and they rehired him through that other company. Like, this is just kind of what they do. As for Xbox's specific cuts that they're facing, it looks like a good number. Again, this is mostly speculation and rumors, and then also some leaks from people that claim to know what's going on. It looks like they are going to be doing major shakeups, specifically within Europe, and they will be pulling out of certain European markets entirely. That likely means that, you know, if we pull up, if we look at it, like, I don't know, for example, how many Xbox consoles are being moved in like Bulgaria, Moldova, Hungary, Lithuania. Like, when they say they're pulling out of certain European markets, they don't mean that they're pulling out of Europe, which I've seen some people say, which is asinine and dumb. Like, I think it was Dreamcast guy was saying Xbox is going to be closing shop in Europe. And it's like, reading's hard. That's not what was said, okay? The expectation is that they're going to be pulling out of some European markets, which could mean, hey, Slovenia, it's not really worth us having a dedicated Xbox team there. So we're going to pull out. And then if you want to buy an Xbox product, you have to buy it from Austria next door. You know, something like that. That being said, they're doing major restructurings, and this is similar to what Ubisoft did actually years ago. So it was like 2.5 years ago. I knew somebody that did marketing stuff with Ubisoft, and she was telling me kind of what went down. Basically, it used to be that, for example, in the US, there would be, you know, a marketing team of 10 people for Ubisoft that worked out of New York, for example. And then there was a West Coast team, and they worked out of Los Angeles or San Francisco or somewhere. And then there was a separate team that worked on northeastern Canada, so maybe they were based in Toronto. And then there was a Western Canadian team that worked out of Vancouver. And so they had all these teams, and, you know, it's small teams, but eventually you're looking at dozens upon dozens upon dozens of employees. And they realized it just didn't really make sense. In the age of the internet, you don't need a local office there. So what Ubisoft did is that they trimmed a ton of fat, and what they saw as fat, and they cut it down. So like the New York team now does all of the coordination for like Montreal and Toronto. So this New York team absorbed all of this instead of just doing this one little area over here. They handled all of this. Same with the West Coast team. They got rid of the Vancouver team. Everything else works through San Francisco. And that seems to be a similar thing to what Xbox is doing here, where they're restructuring and they're cutting a lot of the individual offices that might have been based in like France, a dedicated team in Germany, dedicated team in Poland, dedicated team in Romania. They're cutting that, and then they're going to have one giga team in like France, or two teams in Poland and one in France, something like that. Pretty normal thing. Because you got to remember, what happens at these corporations is that somebody like Satya Nadella will say, we need to trim our budgets. You need to cut 3% here, 4% there, and that will help us achieve these financial targets. We can tell investors at the end of our fiscal year, we achieve those targets, and next year our margins are going to be even higher, and we can move on from there. Everything will be great. It's just how running a corporation works, a publicly traded, company. And so effectively, that's what they're doing, is that they are going to trim where they need to trim, and they tell Phil, you need to trim 3% of your workforce, and he has to find places to do that, and that's what he does. Even if Xbox, saw revenues grow by 5% or 6%, you do have to factor in like inflationary pressures and macroeconomic factors and stuff like that. In the case of Microsoft and gaming specifically, inflation's been a big problem for them. So even if they saw revenues raised by 5%, if inflation rose by 5%, they didn't actually grow. The company didn't get bigger. It didn't start making effectively more money. It stayed still because inflation is a thing. So it's unfortunately a very normal thing. I don't find this particularly shocking. And frankly, a lot of this will probably not have that seismic of an impact on like their operations, because like I said, what happened when my dad got laid off is they laid off parts of his team, and then they just rehired them as contractors or rehired them from another company that scooped them up. But for their balance sheet, it looks like they just cut labor work and their labor costs pretty significantly by like 2-3%. But effectively, they increased the budget of the contractors' work and all that. So it didn't actually move the needle that much. It just kind of moved things around so it looked better on the balance sheet. Again, it's pretty normal. And the other kind of elephant in the room with this is that Microsoft and Xbox specifically has not been doing so great, specifically in like non-US markets. So like Europe, it's struggled. It's certainly doing better in Europe than it's been doing in like Japan, for example. But Europe is not a super strong market for them compared to like their bread and butter, the US. And so if they're going to make cuts, it makes sense to make cuts in Europe. There's not much left to cut in Japan and in Eastern markets because they don't have that big of a presence there. So, Satya tells them you need to trim 3%. It makes sense that they would look here and handle things that way. Figured we would talk about it because it is news that will probably officially break in the next couple of days, that they will announce. Maybe Friday they'll announce officially that the layoffs are hitting. But it's unfortunately a very common thing in this space. And it's not necessarily an indication that like Microsoft is doing poorly. If anything, it's an indication that Microsoft is handling business as usual. Unfortunately, they do this pretty regularly, where they just kind of burn and churn. And it's just the way Microsoft does it. Microsoft treats people very much like numbers or like little pieces to play with. It's just how a corporation that's worth $3 trillion does things. It means they have trouble retaining talent, but they kind of have enough money elsewhere that they'll just hire that talent back as contractors, and it's just how it works. So what are you gonna do? Less people working for them, more subcontractors, because when you're a contractor, they typically, in some cases they do, but typically they don't have to deal with, they don't have to deal with all the crazy incentives and insurance and healthcare and stock options. They don't have to do any of that when you're a contractor, and because you need to pay for your living, they can just hire you as a contractor and you'll take the job because you need the money. It's just, again, it's unfortunately a very common thing in corporate America. It really sucks. took my thing.